Okay, well, I might start with a little bit of an intro about myself. So, my name is Chris Bailey, and I first got involved in management systems as a laboratory manager for Manaaki Whenua Landcare Research. And there's a certification called ISO 17025, which is the certification for testing laboratories to say your tests are up at a certain standard and people can trust the results that come out of those. So that was my first introduction about 20 odd years ago into the idea about management systems and the ISO standards. And since then, I've been involved in a lot of work with hazardous substances and helping laboratories to make sure they're managing those risks in a sensible fashion, and health and safety as well. And I worked at Auckland Regional Council for 3 years in the consents and compliance team. So on top of that, I've been working with businesses to help them implement environmental management systems for over 12 years now. So I'm a bit of a convert for management systems, as you can imagine. Now, in this format of webinar that we're using, we invite people to put in questions as they come to mind through the chat function, which you should see on the sidebar. There's a thing with 2 speech bubbles on it where people can put in questions that they've got, and I can see a number of people. It's called Emmerdale now. Thank you, Lee. Some people are putting in some comments already, which is wonderful. So if you put in questions as they arise in your mind, we can be sure to capture them all. If you've got a burning need to speak, click on the little hand up speak icon that's on the side as well, and it'll notify us that somebody really needs to say something, and we can give you the opportunity to do so. But for most people, there's no ability to speak to us at this stage. We wanted to make sure we could capture all of the questions, because it is possible that we could run over time, in which case we will give you a written answer to each of the questions that you've got. And we're planning on recording this session as well. So it will be available to people later on, and whoever would like to see it, you're most welcome to see it. Okay, so what's our goal here today? Well, I firmly believe that an environmental management system can transform an organization. And by understanding what an environmental management system seeks to do, we can see how that spills over to the rest of the organization. So that's part of what we're going to be looking at today. It also creates a set of skills in your people that lifts overall performance. And it can be the first opportunity for some businesses to start working on the business, not just in the business. So it gives you the chance to step back and look at everything and say, what's going on? Are we in control of all the things we want to be in control of? Okay. Is an environmental management system a necessary evil? What is it that an EMS is actually trying to achieve? Well, it's about really looking at the organization. It's about guiding how you focus your resources to get the outcomes that you want. And sometimes you're not even necessarily sure what those outcomes are at the beginning. By understanding problems and what your desired goal is, it gives you a way to resolve it in a more complete manner. Anytime we pause and really look at a business, there's a chance to get better outcomes. And that's true for all of our lives. If you can pause, look at what's going on, invariably you can get more control over the desired outcomes. This is something that we've never really been taught to do. It's something that they teach people in the MBA process about pausing and looking at something and unpacking it, understanding all of the complexities, looking at what our goals are, and then making plans to get there. If we can't see a clear way forward, it can be overly daunting. There's a risk of wasting your effort. You may achieve the wrong outcomes, undesirable outcomes, and you've got a possibility that you'll lose focus partway through and actually not get to where you want to go. Now, any management system uses this sort of 4-staged approach. The ISO 14001 system is the basis for the EnviroMark program, and it was created by the wise old heads at the ISO International Standards Organization by identifying all the ways disasters have happened in the past. So what are the things that have really gone wrong, and why did they go wrong? What was the cause of that? Each of the criteria that we look at, each of the important things to be in control of, is a set of processes or systems which manage one of those weak points. The system can be broken down into those 4 steps, and those are groupings of those weak points. And in implementing an environmental management system or any management system, it manages the working on those areas. The first of these groupings of ideas is in the planning section. You need to understand where you're starting from, what's going on and why. What are the things you need to be doing to run your business? We call those normal activities. What are the maintenance type activities that happen in the background? They're your abnormal activities. And when you're doing your normal and your abnormal stuff, if an emergency happens, which of those are going to be a huge problem? They're your emergency situations. Once you've understood where you're starting from, then you need to understand where you want to be. What's the end goal? Why is that desirable? Why do we need to be there? We can't stay where we are. It's broken. Why do we need to go to this new place? Once you've got the idea of where you're starting from and where you're going to, what's the stepwise process to get from the place you are to where you want to be? How will you get to your goal in manageable steps? This creates targets. This creates your expected outcomes. At this point, there's also a piece of work that isn't in the ISO standards, but we always include around change management. How do we make it as painless as possible for organizations to go through those steps of that process? So, we understand what we want to do now. How do we do it? Well, we do it in bite-sized chunks. You can't eat an elephant in one sitting. You've got to do it in one mouthful at a time. When you need something to be done, there's a thing about making sure that somebody's been given the role and given the responsibility and authority to carry out that role. We need to, at this stage, build in management to every single step, because otherwise, how do you know if you're achieving what your goal was? Right. Management thinker Peter Drucker is often quoted to say, you can't manage what you can't measure. In this planning step that we were looking at earlier, we asked, if this works, what will we see? What will the expected outcome be? If we compare what we're seeing as an outcome to what we expected to see, we can then ask the question, is this good? Is this the outcome we were hoping for? In my experience, this step is the most difficult one for organizations to come to grips with. This is where most of the learning really happens. People know what they do as a business. They have a pretty good idea about what kind of projects they might want to run. The problem is, once the projects start, people just sort of let them go and expect they're going to get the results they wanted. And 9 times out of 10, it's just not like that. You don't get the results you were hoping for. Nobody asks, is this good? So the question is, why is that? I've got a little bit of a story here. Resistance to change is not normally a conscious resistance. People don't say, well, I don't feel like changing, I'm not going to. It's an evolutionary advantage that's been built into us, not to change something that seems to be working. If you met this in a jungle and you look down at the ground and you see a pointy stick, you pick up the pointy stick and the tiger comes towards you and you jab it. Doesn't like the experience, it runs away. Okay, good solution. You get back to the local village and the people there said, well, why didn't you throw it? You should throw it next time. You'll be further away from the tiger, you'll be safer. That's a good idea. And you think to yourself, well, if I do that and I miss, it'll eat me. This is the idea that's behind why it's built into us, to avoid trying to change something or even looking at it too seriously if it seems to be working already. If you change something, it may stop working. And we seek reliable and reproducible outcomes. In overcoming this resistance, we need to bring thinking to a conscious level. This is where the planning and the plan to do and the planned reviewing actually become really important, because you're not just leaving those things to, oh, people will do it. People will remember to check these things. They won't, or they may not, and we don't want to risk that. This is why it's been included by those wise old heads at the ISO organization. This is one of the areas that is most often the cause of failure for systems, is because we innately avoid looking at things that we expect to work, and we need to overcome that. So you want to clearly see what the goal is ahead. You need to believe in that goal. You want that end result. You want that change. If you don't want that change, you're going to be fighting against it on a subconscious level. And you can clearly see how to get there. So again, you've got where you're starting from, you've got where you're heading to, and you've got this lovely stepwise process to get you to A and B. And once all of that is clearly seen, you can overcome this psychological resistance to change. That's what change management's all about. Now, a management system is part of this story in that it helps you unpack all of these areas and get clear understanding of them. But then you also have to actually pull it all up in front of people's faces and look at it and go, let's look at this and understand it. Let's understand why we can't stay where we are now. Let's understand the goal that we're trying to get to and what life will be like once we fix these issues. And then let's look at the planned steps, the manageable steps to get from A to B. Okay? Once you can see what the changes are, well, what things are not working, you can feed that piece of work back into the plan, do, check cycle, and we call that ACT, where you take the piece of work that's not quite the way you wanted it to be and make changes. Now, there are two ways you can approach that. Let's say we thought to ourselves, we want to alter the pH of water that's going into our trade waste system. Okay, so we're going to use a different kind of washing product to do that. So the pH is currently quite high and we would like it to be quite low. Let's make those changes. You do those changes and you don't get the results you expected. You thought it was going to come down to pH 7 from pH 9. It didn't. It came down to 8. Okay, so it's not the expected result. What are you going to do about that? Well, either you can go back and investigate and find out why it didn't work and try and fix it so it does work. Or you might say, well, actually 8's good enough. So although we didn't hit the target we thought we'd hit, we will set a new target at this point. We'll say 8's good enough, so we're going to set it to 8. In all the experience I've had with health and safety programs, and one of the big changes that's come recently in health and safety in the last few years, is the need to go back and check on outcomes to see that they've been embedded. The plan, do, check, act, that check, act part, it's a really good idea to include that sometime down the track again and again. So you might complete your project and then come back in 3 months and check and see, did that work? And then 12 months, is it still working? Are we still getting the results we hoped for? It doesn't take an awful long period of time, but it makes sure that it really does happen. It's about keeping that cycle going. Plan, do, check, act. Plan, do, check, act. Plan, do, check, act. It just keeps ticking over like a wheel rolling down the road. I say to people that in managing an environmental management system, you're going to need to put in 2 hours a week, every week for the rest of your working life. And that's not a bad expectation to have. There's going to be a bit of work going on a regular basis to keep this thing ticking over and to keep it working well. Okay? Excellent. All right. So how will we transform a business in this way if we don't have a formal environmental management system in place, or if we're starting to build one? I had in mind, many people who are present today will probably be quite interested in how you can do this on a sort of an immediate or light approach. If you want these systematic processes and benefits, but you want them now, and you don't want them in 12 months' time once you've installed your whole system, create a very simple plan, do, check, act process. From my experience, the Westminster Committee system or team type based system is the easiest way to achieve this. So you form a team and you have regular meetings. Most people tend to go for something like a monthly meeting or a quarterly meeting, reasonably regular, not weekly, but reasonably frequently. For each meeting, you have an agenda that reminds you of all the things you want to look at. The first thing on the agenda is, what did we say we were going to do last time? Let's look at each of those things and see how they're going. Once you've got that, all of those historical things reassessed, like let's say, for example, somebody was doing a piece of work and they were to take some measurements. You would say to the person, okay, Chris, you were due to do these measurements now. How did that go? What did you see? Did it align with the expected results? And then you have a bit of a discussion about it. You can actually look at how well is this working? Do we need to act? This has turned this meeting into the review step and the planning step. The doing happens after the meeting, and then gathering the information comes in. And then if we need to act and change something, that can happen after the meeting too. I've put down there overview review. This is about a less frequent assessment by the senior leadership team of the organization. Is this work of this group leading the business in the direction that we want to go in? Okay. So I've asked Craig Loveridge to come. He's head of commercial, I believe, at Blue Star Group, to come and talk about their recent experience with implementing an environmental management system, whether they got the results they hoped for, whether there were any unexpected and cool results. Craig, so Craig, can you tell us a bit about Blue Star?
Yeah, so look, we are a large commercial printing business in New Zealand, geographically spread across the country. So we when we started this exercise, we had about 12 separate businesses under the group, operating from 10 sites. And just to make things more challenging, when we embarked on the enviromark process with Chris and the team, we also were going through a consolidation of brand. So, we had a 15 or 20 year legacy, a history of acquisition or acquired businesses that probably about 12, 18 months ago, we looked to consolidate under one brand and obviously also rationalize a few sites. So, and then at the same time, because we thought that wasn't enough work, as I say, we wanted to go down the sustainability route, or further down the sustainability route. Some of our sites had already had bronze and silver, and one site had just gotten gold status, but we wanted to consolidate and standardize our EMS platform across the group. So yeah, we engaged Enviromark, primarily because obviously we'd seen the market shift finally from a lot of talk around sustainability requirements and business bluntly and winning business, to actually starting to have actually a bit of a groundswell where you know, there was a lot more talk or credit to actually what was kind of required or requested to in tender responses. So it wasn't necessarily just a commercial process that we wanted to go through, but it was perfectly timed around lining up our businesses to consolidate into one EMS platform. Chris, do you want me just to keep talking through the process?
Absolutely. Yep.
So as I said, we chose to standardise on one platform moving forward, and then across 9 sites in the end, we basically kind of ended up working with 4 primarily health and safety team leaders across the businesses to try and get a level of consolidation and standardization. And to be fair, you know, phase 2, so all of our sites now are Enviromark Gold certified, Toitū certified Gold. The next phase for maintaining the accreditation is actually going to be further centralizing of the mechanics of how we got to the certification, because, you know, we highlighted 4 team leaders that were kind of came from health and safety backgrounds. You know, the way we got to the certification had some nuances that were different across each site, and particularly to get bronze, it's very excuse me, very site specific. And of course, while you could put a net around all of our sites and say, oh, they all print, functionally some of the sites do things fundamentally different and than others, and use different materials. And of course, the other thing that overarches all of this is that we are a primary producer. So, you know, bluntly, we just print a lot of stuff. So that in its own right, you know, creates complications and challenges that we can actually put in place around environmental gains. So one of the many things that we got out of this was obviously not only a consolidation or improvement in our environmental footprint, but I guess from a cultural or staffing perspective, you know, everyone really bought into it, because at every site we disseminated projects out to end users. And I think, you know, when we started the process, everyone was expecting that we had to look at these massive big projects, you know, solar panels on roofs and all these other kind of things that are, you know, oftentimes cost prohibitive. They sound fantastic, but you can end up basically spinning in the mud, basically not getting ahead. And with a bit of guidance from Chris and the guys, it was the realization that, you know, many bite-sized projects and small projects actually are oftentimes more successful and faster enacted and enabled than actually these massive, you know, time and money intensive projects. You know, and particularly the way our market has shifted, even pre-COVID. You know, we've had a lot more success with multiple staff members getting behind projects, and little bite-sized chunks. And I think one of the things that Chris touched on just before was quite relevant as well, was it's okay to test and fail. You know, part of the process, and particularly going through the audits, when we kind of came time to have the assessors on site, was actually, as Chris alluded to earlier, it's actually, we might have started off with wanting to hit a 7, but we got an 8. And applying that logic to any other downstream thing that you want. You know, we said we wanted to reduce our unstructured waste by a certain number, and we didn't get there, but that's okay. Because it's not necessarily a pass and fail. It's around the documentation and the audit process that we got to the outcome that said, you know, perhaps our aim was too high with whatever the number was, and as long as we can validate that the number we got to is the best reduction or the best reduced outcome, and then look to maintain it on a sustainable basis, was actually a tick. So, a lot of the guys had to change their thinking to that of being a bit more pragmatic and a bit more realistic around what the certification entailed. So I think I kind of covered up a few different things in a typically kind of random order. But as I say, it was as much around the sustainability journey that we're already on, that we look to try and consolidate, as much as it was actually a cultural shift from our guys, and it helped us reinforce the consolidation of the business as a whole, and also put ownership back onto 600 odd staff, that they were part of the journey, and having a guy on the factory floor own a project and actually see it to fruition, was a lot more satisfying for them, and a lot more satisfying for all of our staff than, as I say, oftentimes some of these big chunky projects that we the way things are or were, particularly, we're going to struggle to get off the ground. So I guess my takeaways from this would be, test and fail is okay, as long as you're reporting and learning on it. Bite-sized chunks, and also, I guess, the coming together of the team around one common goal would be probably my 3 takeaways.
Thank you, Craig. That's awesome.
Cool.
So I was really quite chuffed to hear about the guys on the shop floor picking up projects and working with them. That's one of the things that I think is really useful, and it comes back to this idea of teaching people how to do business. How to plan what they're doing, how to implement what they're doing, how to check and see whether it's worked, and to improve it and to keep it going in the future. This is the thing that I think is the most beneficial part that comes out of any management system, and fortuitously the desire of a lot of organizations that are putting out tenders these days is, do you have an environmental management system? Well, it's a chance for people to build all of these other things in at this point. And it was also interesting to hear Craig talking about centralizing the mechanics of running a system. What can often happen is that systems get tailored to the way of thinking, the mental processes of the individuals who are doing it. So if you've got somebody who loves graphs and data, then they're going to concentrate their project around that. Whereas other people might just look at the end number on the bottom of an invoice. How much power did we use? So it's really, it can be a struggle to find ways of presenting data and presenting information that suits everybody's learning style. But that's just part of what we have to keep in mind when we're thinking, are we communicating this stuff in a way that suits the audience? Okay, well, thank you very much, Craig. That's awesome. What I'm going to do at this point is, we're trying to do is engage a systems-based approach to how we run our business. There is actually a planned way how we do stuff. We use the wisdom of others in working out what those systems need to be, and that could be things we do. We embed the process into a group. It's not the only way of doing it. It's a nice, simple way of doing it. There are other ways to control your management system. I think the group approach is the easiest, and it protects you against an important person leaving and suddenly you don't have the expertise in the business anymore. You've shared that expertise amongst a group. And it's all about planning, implementation, review, and then connecting back your learning from the review back into planning, implementation, review. Plan, do, check, act. Okay, so the first question that we've got on our list here: in your experience, what's the biggest barrier that that you see organizations experience when trying to develop and implement an EMS. The most problematic barrier is when you've got somebody in the organization who already thinks they know how to do this, or feels that it's a criticism for the way they've been doing things. So from my perspective, it's really important to take this as a no blame approach to understanding what's going on in an organization and what other options there might be. Lee Radcliffe says, do you consider Enviromark as a stepping stone to ISO 14001 certification? Well, the Enviromark Diamond level contains all of the requirements of the ISO 14001 certification, and also includes an assessment of compliance with legislation. So it's actually a little bit more than ISO 14001, but includes any of those components, all of those components. So I wouldn't call it a stepping stone, although you can use it as a stepping stone. If you have an international market who doesn't recognize Enviromark, then you would want to go to ISO 14001, and you can use our approach to get there and to achieve everything that's needed for ISO certification. The question's going to be, what's most beneficial from your perspective? Do you want something that's recognised within the New Zealand market, or do you need something that's more widely recognised in the way of a certification? They both contain all the same components with a little bit more rigour around compliance for the Enviromark side of things. Ranjana says, any tips on driving engagement and buy-in? People are very keen to know that their opinion has been included in decision making. One of the problems that can occur in implementing an EMS is that it happens within a little siloed group. And when that happens, it's very unlikely that you're going to connect to the rest of the people and they're going to feel part of what's going on. In the standard itself, in the criteria of the standard, this is the section around communication. It's about ensuring that people know what's happening and become part of it at the earliest opportunity of your journey. And that's going to develop over time. In the ISO standard, it talks about for internal communication and awareness. So awareness is, does everybody in your organization know what's going on? And communication is, are they actively involved in the discussions and knowing where we're heading to next?
And Chris, could I just add there really quickly that to that point, it's also a top down that, you know, your business leaders really need to buy into this. They need to be the ones that drive it and actually believe it from a business perspective, because you know, when they're out, whether it's webinars or on site or whatever, and we spent a lot of time communicating to all of the staff to get their buy-in and to understand that it wasn't just you know, green just talk, that this was ingrained in our thinking for the future. And you know, simple things, you know, some competitions, as I say, getting the guys involved in projects on the factory floor, kind of got the buy from the top down, the bottom up, basically.
Yeah. You'll see under the planning section, there's a bit there about leadership. That's part of what you kind of need to include very early on in the planning, is making sure that what you think you're going to be doing is understood by those who hold the purse strings. Because one of the most demotivating things that can happen is something more important comes up and the resources get taken away and people get put on hold for the work that they're doing. Yeah, looks like a number of people are finding that their systems are freezing. Kate is asking Craig, how did you, or at least I think it's to Craig, how did you overcome any personal sustainability bias in your team? You still there with us, Craig? No, I might have lost Craig, or it might just be me freezing. Can't really tell, I'm afraid. Oh,
Sorry,
Craig's back.
I'm back, Chris. Yep.
Excellent.
Sorry,
So Kate was asking, how did you overcome any personal sustainability bias in your team?
Yeah, look, I mean, funny enough, we had Chris and I were talking before around one of our guys, particularly had a very who was one of the four health and safety guys that we kind of earmarked to run the process for a couple of sites. You know, he was very opinionated in a lot of his views, and I think it was just actually working through those views with Chris and with our team around, you know, this is how we want, what we want to achieve from a group perspective. And I think he was probably one of the guys who was shooting too high and too structured and too detailed and not really being pragmatic enough. So, you know, it was actually a bit of a hold, hug, you know, walk down the road, share the thinking, change the thinking, and then it's at a point in time, I think I kind of had to kind of just give him a bit of a prod, but you know, he came around to the group thinking. So I think it's just a case of actually bringing every person on the journey, pretty much. It was probably a worked example of what you might have asked.
Yeah, yeah. And from where I was looking at the situation, what had happened is that some of the project champions were doing it in a way that made sense to them, and it suited their learning style. It suited the way they could think through issues. And this person had a different approach. And they were saying, well, how can that be right? And I'm saying, well, because it gets them to the same answer in the end, but they go a slightly different way around the mountain than you're going, but you're getting to the same place in the end. We just need to make sure that you're covering all of the distance you need to until you get to where we want you to be. Shaz says, were there any time and cost barriers? Craig, I think that might be one to you.
Yep. Look, we definitely took longer to get there to gold. We had our kind of BHAG was gold from kind of half our let's say half our sites were bronze or thereabouts. We wanted to try and get up and running in about 8 months, and it took a chunk longer than that, you know, over 12 months. But we had some other things, as I alluded to early on, going on with, you know, a consolidation of business, rebranding, a bunch of other external influences really that impacted on it. You know, from a cost perspective, not much in the way of material cost, other than the fact that it is, you know, there is a bit of time involved, and as Chris touched on earlier on, 2 hours a week when you're there, but certainly while you're getting there, it was probably the equivalent of 2 to 3 days FTE a week, probably two, in the real world. And you know, if we're all real about that, you know, no one, not least before COVID, you know, probably has the luxury of just plucking out an FTE and putting them in a room for 2 days and expecting them to do their normal job. So, you know, I guess it's being realistic around the time involved to get the certification through, but there wasn't a lot of above the line cost. You know, we certainly saw probably, if anything, a little bit of cost out, particularly around you know, waste, some consolidation, and also pushing a lot of our thinking back into our supply chain, who coincidentally and encouragingly also kind of came along on the journey too, which was cool.
Definitely. One of the little fish hooks that sometimes I think people should be aware of is ask yourself the question of what will happen if your project champion leaves. So you don't want to restart from scratch again. So I encourage people to capture their thinking along the journey so that it's very easy for somebody just to pick it up and continue along the way. It's about creating systems and reliable processes. This is why a team is quite good, because then everybody's seen how it's been done, but it's not the only way of doing it. And one of the people who's here with us today, I was involved in helping her to capture her thinking along the journey, and it was always, yes, this is the end document you're going to use, but let's capture the thinking of why you chose to do it the way you did it. And that makes the whole thing so much more robust and easy for everybody to use in the future. And that's the idea behind things like what the standard calls work instructions and document control systems. It's about embedding that stuff in. Okay, Lee asks, how is the certification assessment carried out? So the same as an ISO audit, each of those criteria that I talked about, each of those weak points that needs to be assessed, the auditor will go to the site and say, this is the criteria I'm looking for. How are you managing that? How are you controlling it? How are you making sure it's going to work now and into the future? Now, a really good auditor can talk to you about the way you do stuff and tease out the answers to that without actually asking those direct questions. But what they are doing is they're saying, okay, here's all of the, in our case, bronze level criteria. Are they meeting this one? Do I have faith that will continue into the future based on what I'm seeing? And the next one, and the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And once you've answered all of the criteria and they've met all of the criteria, then they can be certified. Because it's about saying, yes, they're doing it properly now, and we have confidence they're going to keep doing it properly into the future. Sometimes people can't see that happening because the auditors are really good at their job and they're pulling the information together without actually needing to ask all of the questions up front. But it's exactly the same process in both audits. The ISO audits tend to take longer. They were created around the audit protocols were created around very high risk businesses, chemical factories, oil refineries, plastics manufacturing, anything that could be catastrophic if it went wrong. And so the depth at which those things are dug down to confirm that they're all perfectly in control is often deeper. That is done in the situations where it's necessary by the Enviromark program. It's a little bit around the professional auditors' assessment of how high that risk on that side is. Hopefully that answers your question, Lee. Does anybody else have any other questions? Because I think we may have almost got to the end of our session then. Nobody else? Furiously typing. I can't see anything. Well, unless somebody pops one up in the next couple of minutes, I would love to thank everybody for your attendance. You'll be sent an email later on telling you where you can find the links to the presentation if you want to share it with anybody else. Everybody will be very understanding of the technical glitches that we've had. Yeah. Oh, here we go. Shaz asks, did you use Excel or any other system? We tend to use, I tend to encourage people to use Excel to capture their thinking. So normally things like an aspects and impacts register, it's done through a series of tabs in Excel where we give them a worked example and people can work through that to see, okay, well, that's how that person did it. If I tweak these things, that would be me. So they can tweak it, and then the next bit, and the next bit, and the next bit. What are some key improvements that need to occur to reach diamond from gold? It's a lot around the robustness of your meta system, if you like. The way that you annually review things. So how do you check your register of legislation and other requirements is up to date? There needs to be processes around that are so clear that nobody can get them wrong. Then you need to, once you've got processes that no one could get wrong, you have the internal audits at Diamond coming in, checking that people did it that way, and that you got the results you hoped for, and whether it could be done better again. So the difference between gold and diamond is mainly around ensuring the robustness of the system into the future, to make sure that things will always happen the way you want them to. Most of the practical environmental improvements around risks and opportunities actually are happening at the gold level. And this higher level of robustness comes in at the diamond level. I say to people that small businesses where everybody's talking to each other all the time, so under 60, 80, 100 staff, you've got to ask yourself the question, do you need all these extra levels of reassurance? If you've got a very small team, 6 people who are running this, they're all working on it together, you're having monthly meetings to check and see how things are going, do you really need to have internal audits to double check and see that they really did what they said they'd do when everybody's keeping everybody honest? Well, I would argue perhaps not. It's an extra drain on resources that may not give you a benefit for a smaller organization. This is why we have the different levels, is that they're suited to different needs. So the bronze level is all about saying, what are the absolute minimums that we have to do to meet regulatory obligations? What's the minimum environmental stuff we must do? The gold level is saying, what should we do and what can we do? And the diamond level is saying, is it all going to keep running into the future? Have we made it so robust that no matter who leaves, it's going to keep working? Okay, so it's the different levels suit different sizes of organizations and different needs, but they're built on each other. So the bronze level is your starting place where you're saying, well, we have to do these things. And once they're all under control, you'd be going, well, what are the other things that we should do? And what can we actually do? Because we can't necessarily do all of the nice to have stuff. And then we build that next level of complexity and robustness into the system at the diamond level. And whatever level you need to be at, that's the one you're working towards. Okay. Any other questions? Are the audit standards available? What we've done is we've created a set of gap analysis tools. So each criteria is paired with an explanation of what we're trying to achieve and what the organization's trying to achieve to meet that specific bit of the work they have to do. And then it includes examples of how to do it, and we give people worked examples that they can look at. So that's the tool that we give to our clients. We can give people a brief version of it, but all of the stuff that's in that audit standard is exactly the same stuff that's in the ISO 14001 standard. The criteria match over one-to-one. We've got a few additional criteria in there. What those additional criteria cover are things like at the gold level, reporting how successful you've been once a year, so creating a summary of outcomes. Because we're not doing the internal auditing at gold level, we decided that was something that should be included at that point to make people do a review and ask the question, is this leading us in the direction we want to go? So we can definitely provide people with a listing of all of the things that are going to be covered in it, and people who aren't members are welcome to ask for a copy of that, and we can provide it. But we only provide the gap analysis tools with clients because that's where the intellectual property has been embedded into how to approach this and what we think the best way. Okay. All right. So I hope that session's been helpful to everybody. It's 5 minutes from when we're due to end. So probably not a bad time to end things. Oh, Natalie asks, how often are people trying to improve beyond legislative requirement? Well, if you're only interested in legislative compliance, which everybody has to do anyway, you probably won't be part of our program. I think we have one client who is with us because they want bronze level confirmation, if you like. And for a risk management, from a risk management perspective, that's what they're interested in. And so they don't go beyond that. Nobody else is in that situation. Everybody progresses to what are the things we should do, and therefore what are the things we can do, and engages with those improvements. And it's the driver from the marketplace is nobody's asking the question, are you meeting the minimums required by the law? That's just assumed that people have to. And it's one of the biggest shocks for organizations when they discover that there's stuff in there that they didn't even know they were supposed to be doing and they can't answer. Every now and again, we find that businesses have a really nasty fishhook in that they discover that there's a consent that they require for their site that they didn't know they needed. They assumed they didn't. In fact, they did. And it's going to take 8 months to get the consent. And I have had one client historically who was trying for 8 years to get their air discharge consent and kept fighting with council over modelling of the plume of odour that came from their site to try and get that consent, and they never actually got it. In the end, they said, "Oh, sorry, we just don't know what we're going to do here. We think we need to step back from being a member and what we're doing." But most people find that looking at regulatory obligations will highlight a few things that they needed to have more control over, and after this process they do. And then they can move on to looking at all the beneficial stuff. Thank you, everybody, for your attendance to the seminar. I'm going to close out now. If anybody has any questions, please email us and let us know, and we'll get back to you with some answers as soon as possible. And as I said, the presentation, the recording of it will be made available on our through our webpage or on social media. Thanks very much. Have a lovely afternoon.